But let's understand first how those spaces are made by. Now you guys have your bone down here, and you have your palmar aponeurosis, which is a very important structure I told you previously, because it attaches the deep structures to the subcutaneous tissue, so that when you want to do a hand grip, everything, the skin wrinkles all the way with the contraction of those muscles. Now the palmar aponeurosis, you guys, that you have it on the top and you have the bones on the bottom, this palmar aponeurosis is going to send septa. Okay, so if I have palmar aponeurosis up and I have bones down, my metacarpals, the palmar aponeurosis from the lateral edge of it, it's going to send, we have 5 metacarpals. We have 5 metacarpals. Okay, we have, if we want to say that this is the thumb, then this is laterally, so this is the first metacarpal, and this is the 5th. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I have extra one here. Let's say this is number 3. So the palmar aponeurosis guys, from the lateral edge, it's going to send a septa called medial palmar septa. The palmar aponeurosis is going to send a septum called lateral palmar septum, and it's going to send a central one in the middle. We call it mid palmar septum, or intermediate palmar septum, or middle palmar septum. When we have a palmar aponeurosis that sends septa here, septa in the middle, septa there, it's going to divide the central area into mid palmar space and thinner space. And the thinner space is subdivided into another space, and I will tell you that later on. Now, if I'm telling you that the palmar aponeurosis is very superficial up and your bones are very deep down, so what are the boundaries of the spaces you have? Let's remember that we had interossei filling in between the muscles. And let's also remember that we have a muscle called adductor pollicis, and this muscle is actually covering the first and second interossei. So that is going to delete the first and second interossei from my boundaries. It's going to be replaced by the adductor pollicis longus muscle. Okay? So now, what is going to be around me? I'm going to have the palmar aponeurosis up there. I'm going to have the metacarpals down here with the interossei between them. What was, you guys, running below the palmar aponeurosis that I told you I need to connect them to the skin? It's the tendons. It's the tendons of flexor digitorum superficialis and flexor digitorum profundus. Okay, if these are your fingers here, it means for the lateral 3 digits, I have flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus. And from the, if this is my 2 fingers, the medial 2 fingers, this is the thumb and this is the fingers, it means I have here for the pollicis and I have here for the index, flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus. So the spaces are made by, first of all, the orange one here is the mid palmar space, and the, let me give you another, and the green one here is gonna be your thinner space. Okay, so the thinner space. So what are the boundaries of the mid palmar space? Very easy. I have on top of me, I have palmar aponeurosis, I have the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus tendons of my last 3 digits. And on the other side, I have the metacarpals, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and I have the interossei between them. What is medial and what is lateral? It's your lateral palmar septum, and in the medial side, you have your intermediate palmar septum or mid palmar septum, or whatever you want to call it. All right. Did I say lateral? This is medial. Sorry, guys. This is the little finger. So this is medial. You just put it. You put your hand like that, and you will be able to say it. Now, what about the thinner? The thinner, it's near to my thumb. Great. My boundaries are palmar aponeurosis, the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus for the index. All right. for the index. And then I have the flexor pollicis longus tendon. All right. And I will tell you about the radial bursa later on, but this is basically wrapping around the tendon. Anyway, and what is behind me? All right, I don't have the metacarpals and the interossei because the adductor muscle is actually running between me and the bones. So this is gonna be my deep boundary, and on my sides I'm going to have, this is because I keep forgetting the orientation. This is the thumb. All right, so this is the thinner space. Thumb is lateral. It means my boundaries are the lateral palmar septum and the intermediate palmar septum. Okay, so did you guys understand where are these spaces? Okay, do you understand where is the here you have the mid palmar space? Can you understand now the boundaries, and can you understand your boundaries of the thinner space? All right, and then you will have the hypothinner space, which is basically a small space between the septum that we made from the palmar aponeurosis and your muscle there. Okay, why they're important, we're gonna talk about that, but when we finish the stories about the hand. Okay, guys, I liked this schematic diagram, but the only thing I didn't like about it is that you guys can study. This is a very nice schematic diagram, but I'm sure everyone understands now the boundaries and everything around you in the mid-palmar space and the thinner, and it's nicely showing you how the septum that went from the palmar aponeurosis to attach itself into the metacarpals. The only thing I didn't like here, guys, is that they wrote the space between the tendons and the palmar aponeurosis, which is not correct. Like, the space should be here. Okay, it should be between the palmar aponeurosis plus the tendons are superficial to you, and the bones with the interossei are deep to you, and then you have the septum around you. All right, so just use this schematic diagram. It's very nice as a recap, but make sure to understand that the spaces are between the bones and interossei from one side and the palmar aponeurosis and the tendons of the whatever fingers you are. And don't forget the lumbricals, guys. Okay, don't forget the lumbricals, because the lumbricals are following always the flexor tutorum profundus. All right, so you don't need to forget them. They are already originating from those tendons. Okay, and then you have something called dorsal subaponeurotic space. We're not going to talk about it. Doesn't have very much significance. And I told you that the adductor space is there because remember that the muscle, the adductor muscle was kind of here. You have the adductor muscle. It was kind of separating your thinner space from those bones. So because you had those this muscle, you will have also a space between that muscle and the people it separated us from, which are basically your first and second metacarpals and the interossei between them. Okay, now the most important spaces are the thinner and the mid-palmar space, and now you understand them and you know their boundaries. Now let's move on to other structures of the hand in order to understand why those spaces are important. You guys, for your tendons, as they want to reach and attach themselves to the bones, you guys, they need to protect themselves. They need to put themselves in kind of, you guys remember the idea of the pleura and the peritoneum? Remember when we had that balloon idea and the fist against balloon, and how the lung was pushing against a closed serous sac, and it attained a visceral layer that is wrapping around it and a parietal layer away from it? You guys, the same idea we have it for the tendon. They are not pushing against, but God created a protective kind of double membrane that has two layers, and it has synovial membrane between them, because we need to protect the tendons as we flex and extend and flex and extend those tendons. We need to protect them from the bones. So the tendons are going to be ensheathed by synovial sheaths. One is visceral around the tendon, one is parietal away from me. Between them I have synovial membrane, and that is wrapping around me. The idea is for this finger and this finger and this finger, the synovial sheaths are going to end at the free border of the palmar aponeurosis. It's not going to continue with me. However, for the little finger and for the thumb, it's going to be continuous all the way with the synovial sheath that wraps around the proximal parts of all tendons. And that is very important, as we said, because that is important for the spread of infection. So remember that the little finger sheath is going to continue all the way with the same sheath that wraps around the tendons at the ulnar side. So that's why we call it ulnar bursa. It's basically the double layer of membrane that is wrapping around the tendons as they want to reach the hand, but on the ulnar side. And the same thing happens up in the radial side, and that all happens like it starts like 2.5 inches above the wrist. The whole idea starts here, because these are the places, guys, that we will have a high friction, and we need to wrap around them and lubricate and, you know, kind of protect them and, you know, reduce the friction. Okay, so the each one of the fingers has its own tendon synovial sheaths with its 2 layers. They stop at that point because here we have palmar aponeurosis. And for the little finger, it's continuous with the one that wraps around all tendons in the ulnar side. So it's continuous with the ulnar bursa. And for the pollices, it's continuous with the radial bursa. I don't know why some of the books, they refer to it as radial bursa as a whole, but it should be the finger itself is continuous with the radial bursa. Maybe sometimes they call it as the same thing because it's on the radial side. Anyway, the most important thing for me is that you understand the concept. So whether they are the same name, whether not, this is the idea, and this is why we have them. And so now we protected the tendon with 2 layers, visceral and parietal. Let's continue the story to understand what happens. Now, you guys, for any joint, synovial joint, if we have synovial membrane wrapping around me, I need to have a fibrous sheath. And for the fingers, you guys, imagine that you have a tendon and you're wrapping around it with double layers, protecting it, and you have your finger outside of skin. Do you expect that God will leave that tendon without any support? Definitely not. He will create a fibrous connective tissue to connect your synovial sheaths that wraps around your tendon to the subcutaneous tissue. So everything becomes one log. Okay, so it becomes all together, connected together, they move together. Okay, so thanks for this beautiful creation. Thanks God, we have the fibrous digital sheaths that wraps around the synovial sheaths and connects them to the, so if you guys look at the skin, the subcutaneous tissue, you will find that this is your bone. You will have the tendon. It has 2 layers of the synovial membrane, and then you have the fibrous sheaths that wraps around you and connect you to everything around. All right, except it's gonna leave a space for the digital branches to move on. Okay, so this is the idea we have here, so that you understand everything happens in your hand. And so that is what happens, and how the tendons are reaching, and how the synovial sheaths are wrapping around your tendons. Now let's move on to understand what happens, why this is important. Okay, let's get back to this. Now, like you guys, we said now, we have synovial sheaths, and the ulnar bursa and the synovial sheath of the little finger, it opens into the ulnar bursa and it opens into the mid-palmar space, all right? And people in here, in the index finger, the radial bursa, if you look at this region, you will find that they are all connected, all right? And we have a space here above and the distal end of your forearm. It's called a parona space. Okay, parona space, it's in the distal end of your wrist. The idea is those guys are all communicating together at some point. They are all communicating together. But why not these? Because these, remember, they are stopping at this point. Okay, so they are not connected with them. So in the mid-palmar space, we have communication with the little finger, which is continuous with the ulnar bursa. And down here we have communication with the your pollicis finger, your pollex, your thumb. Okay, why am I confusing between the fingers? Okay, so the thumb synovial sheath, okay, is continuous with those guys here and the radial bursa, and then they all connected at and communicating at the corona space of your forearm, and that is with the mid, of course, palmar space. So what will happen is that if there is an infection and it's left untreated in here or there or in the mid palmar space, okay, in the ulnar bursa itself, in the radial bursa, they are all communicating together, and the spread of infection can go all the way from any of these to the rest of the places, all the way to the distal end of the forearm. All right, so in that case, it's gonna do something called horseshoe swelling of the hand, and the reason is what we just said. There is a communication between those guys, the mid-palmar space, the ulnar bursa, the radial bursa in the space of Barona. Okay, so the space of Barona is going to be a space where there is communication between the radial bursa and the ulnar bursa. Okay, so the infection can spread all the way. And also those potential spaces are continuous with the mid-palmar spaces. All right, so you can have spread of infection between them. All right, guys, great. The last thing we have is, I think it's the last, no, still we have the ulnar. The last thing regarding the spaces we have is what we call the bulb space. Bulb space is basically the space that you have in your the distal phalanx, around the below the distal phalanx. The important thing about this space is that, first of all, it's made by fat and blood vessels penetrating them. It's a very tight space. It has septa separating the subcutaneous tissue in here and the fat. It's a very tight space, guys. Okay, now when the digital artery wants to go and supply the distal phalanx, it's going to give one branch to the base of the distal phalanx and another branch to the shaft and the head. If you have an infection and that infection is going to kind of make congestion in your finger, it's going to compress all these branches of the digital artery, so you will have ischemia and problem in the distal 4/5 of your distal phalanx. However, the basal 1/5 is not going to be affected. Okay, that's why, because the branch to the base is different than the others, and that infection is going to compress against these, but the branch of the base of the distal phalanx is going to escape that space, the bulb space, so it's not going to be compressed in type of infection. So it's important that you know where exactly are going to be affected. Now for the arteries, we have the ulnar artery that comes all the way from the ulnar side. The ulnar artery, guys, finishes at superficial palmar arch, okay, and the radial finishes as deep palmar arch. So remember, D, radial artery, finishes as deep palmar arch, and the superficial is the superficial palmar arch, and from there you will get the palmar metacarpal arteries, and then you will have a proper palmar digital, and that will give you the digital branches. Actually, you will do the arch, and then the radial artery will help you to close off that arch. It's gonna send you a superficial branch to close it off. You will have, of course, blood from both, but mainly the medial 3.5 fingers are by ulnar artery, and the lateral 1.5 is by radial artery. Okay, so if you go to the radial artery, you will find that the radial D is going to end as D palmar arch, and it's going to mainly give you the thumb and the half of the index finger. Okay, so that is going to be by the radial artery. Very important thing I want you guys to know is that the radial artery, if you trace it, it gives you very important two branches, one for the thumb and one for the index. The one for the thumb, we call it the princeps pollicis. Princeps means it's the principal artery for the pollicis. It means this is the main artery for the pollicis. It's very important, and that's why we call it, I will tell you why it's important. And then we have radialis indicis. It's gonna give you, why do we call it radialis indicis? Because this is an artery that is coming from the radial to the index, the radial part of the arterial supply of the index finger. So we call it radialis indicis. So these are the continuation of the deep palmar arch, and this is the continuation of radial artery. Now, why the princeps pollicis is very important? Because if you guys look at how the radial artery goes all the way and it gives you the princeps pollicis, it's crucial that you understand that there could be if there is arterial disease, there could be a thrombus that can move all the way. If you think about the whole arterial supply and you think about the subclavian artery, and that gives you axillary and then brachial, and then it gives you the ulnar and radial, the radial continued, and that give you the princeps pollicis. You guys actually up all the way coming from the axillary region, and from your upper limb, that was actually a straight course. So it's very easy for a thrombus to go all the way from a very proximal place up until it reaches the thumb, and it can cause gangrene, and it can affect that and cause ischemic necrosis to the thumb. So can you imagine how that artery is important? You wouldn't even think that the problem was coming from the axilla or from the brachium. All right, so this was because it has a straight course all the way until it gave you the princeps pollicis. Now for the sensory innervation, you have 3.5 and 1.5. So if you look anteriorly, you will find that you have innervation from M letter, you have median nerve, U letter, ulnar nerve. All right, and if you look at the dorsum, you guys, this is the dorsum, right? Yeah, this is dorsum. So this is the dorsum. So actually, the ulnar nerve is dominant. The ulnar nerve decided to take 1.5 in her side, U letter, predominantly by her. So no one is going to share with the ulnar nerve 1.5 fingers. However, the M letter, she's very generous. She's not dominating. She's only going to dominate in her side. The median nerve is going to give you a sensation of the medial 3.5 fingers from the palmar aspect. However, from the dorsal, the radial nerve is going to take care of everything else except for the distal parts of your fingers. It's going to be by median nerve. Okay, so that way you need to know the sensory innervation of the dermatomes, the sensory innervation of your hand, palmar and dorsal. With that, thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next videos.